Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Carlos.
Good morning. I am sharing my screen and I am in charge of discussing with you the next topic in our series. And now the next topic is issues with data collection and data management. The way I see this process is, look, in the last webinar, we were talking about the information products that we're interested in. So for me, the main message was, unless I am very clear about the type of information that I am after in my research process, it's going to be difficult to design the process that is going to take me to obtain that sort of information. And sometimes that is better defined, easier to define. Sometimes it's difficult to define, but without clarity about where we want to get to, it's difficult to start this process. Today's seminar is about data collection and data management. And for me, that represents the next stage. So we know where we want to get to, what we want to build. And we now are going to be talking about the materials that we use for building that information process. So think you're making a cake. So you know what the cake is going to look like. And now we're going to start buying the ingredients. And the ingredients that we use are data. And when I talk about data right now, is data in the widest possible sense. It refers to all these pieces of information that together are going to form a body of data that is going to allow me to analyze the subject of my interest. So issues with data collection and data is what I want to talk to you about. There is something really important here, and it is that your cake, your research is only going to be as good as the quality of the data that you have. So don't do what I did a couple of years ago, which was to actually make a cake with sugar that was 10 years out of date, and it was not a good thing. So don't use data that is bad, because the end product is going to suffer. And so I want to keep at the center of this the idea of quality of data. And I've got three thoughts to share with you to begin with. There are some things that we need to avoid when collecting data and when deciding what data to collect. The first one is, don't collect data that you think it would be nice to have. And the second thing is, don't collect data because it might be useful, and it would be useful just in case. It's not only the issue that we will not use the data, it's the issue that any more data that we collect has an impact on data that is of importance. And I decided to draw by hand this graphic here, and it's one of my pet topics. If you're talking to someone about exchanging information, especially if you're asking questions, there is a point in this interview process where tiredness kicks in. And in the vertical axis, I have a representation of quality going from low at the bottom to high at the top. And on the horizontal, the time that elapses between the start of an interview and the end of it. And you can be pretty sure that the first part of the interview, people are going to be interested, they are going to make an effort. But roughly by the time you get to 40 minutes of interviewing someone, that person will start getting tired. The moment that you hear the question, is this going to take longer? Or they start saying, I'm sorry, I need to go and do something else. And people start expressing the fact that they have given you as much time as they possibly can comfortably. The moment that happens, the quality of the data that you collect declines significantly. And there is a question that we need to ask ourselves, and it is it worth continuing trying to extract data from someone who can no longer provide good data, good information? And it doesn't have to do with willingness, it has to do with tiredness. And so bear in mind those aspects when you are thinking about collecting data, when you're planning your data collection process, and when you're actually talking to people collecting data. So I was watching a video of a colleague who is very experienced in survey data collection. And at the end of this series of slides, I have put the web link, the YouTube link to a series of interviews about data collection. And something that caught my attention was his emphasis on, look, if you're going to ask questions, ask the right questions. Ask them to the right people and ask them at the right time. That will give good quality of data. And of course, this sounds very sensible, but it's something that we often don't do. In preparing this webinar, I was having, I read the standards for collecting sex disaggregated data for gender analysis from the CG, and it's got some really good tools in terms of data collection. I want to refer back to them in this slide, mainly because asking the right questions has to do with being really the questions, the data that is to be collected, being linked explicitly with the information that we want to collect, and that is there. Asking the right people, and I found the language on the standards document quite interesting. They refer to units of a study, which is a word that I use quite frequently. You see that there are good providers of information. There are some characteristics of things that we want to study that belong to specific units. So we need to be very careful in selecting the right unit of study to get the information that we are interested in. And the examples that the standards provide are very, very pertinent. If you are asking about, for example, consumption of food, ask that to either the people who ate the food or the person who prepared the food. If you're asking about episodes of diarrhea in small children, most likely you will not get that information properly from someone who doesn't look after the child. If you're asking issues that have to do with the responsibilities that women have, ask that question to women and don't ask that to men. And that is when it happens at an individual level, and there are characteristics that happen at other levels. And selecting the right unit of study to measure or ask the questions is crucial, because otherwise these proxy answers might not be as good as we want, and very, very often are biased. And ask them at the right time. For me, asking them at the right time doesn't only mean the fact that people are able to remember the answers. Timing is of the essence. Timing of the essence in terms of recalling periods, but timing is also of the essence in terms of availability and energy, especially when we are working in gender-related research. The fact that women tend to be extremely busy at particular times of the day, and so do men in different activities. The fact that when we go in and we start interviewing people or start accompanying them, and to some extent, hopefully not too much, interrupting their activities, has an important effect on the quality of data. So timing is quite important. Now, there are issues here with our availability, and it is okay, people have time in the evening, but we cannot be in the places where they live in the evening, because we need to go back to somewhere we can sleep and have internet connection to upload our data. And there are all sorts of complexities that play into this. And often what we do as researchers is find a compromise in which our respondents have to make an extra effort, and that affects the quality of the data. And look, there is no perfect answer to this problem, but we need to be aware that in the context that we normally work, which is with people who are in conditions of poverty, or at least in challenging conditions to make a living, time is one of their limiting resources. And the fact that they are talking to us at least means that they are not resting, if not that we're interrupting operations and activities that are important to generate income or keep alive. So these elements, although they are very general, have a really important effect on the quality of the data that we collect. And I have some more specific issues about data that I think one should remember when collecting and accumulating. Look, please remember that data need identifiers. So I collect data, I need to know which unit it came from, I need to know where it comes from, I need to know when it was collected. These unique identifiers help us doing that, and they are going to be key in the management and analysis of the information later on. So if you are designing a form for data collection, make sure that you define how you're going to uniquely identify each instance of data that is collected. And the problem of not generating them properly occurs more frequently than you would believe. So if you remember anything about what I'm going to say today, remember that unique identifiers are important. And there are important group identifiers, and I'm going to say that it's obvious to you and it's obvious to me that when we're working with gender, the proper identification of the gender of the respondent is crucial. So this takes me to the second point, and it is that data might come from different units. And these units, study units, have natural structures and hierarchies. And when collecting data, we need to understand them well. So the first one that I started mentioning are units that are different because we're interested in comparing, contrasting, and understanding the relation, and probably understanding the relationship between them. The obvious one is gender in our case. But those are not the only ones. There are different types of groups that can be formed, and deciding what those groups are and reflecting that in our data collection decisions is important. Remember that it's not only in the data collection decisions, it's also on the design of the research process. And so we're going to be talking at some point about recommendation domains, for lack of a better word or description, and it is groups of units that we are interested in describing and making inferences or recommendations about. And it's clear that males and female individuals or groups of individuals are going to be important in the gender-related work. That means that design decisions and data collection decisions have to be considered carefully for each of these groups, including, for example, sample sizes. Then the other thing is that units are arranged very often in hierarchies. So let me give you an example: communities, household, individuals. And this generates what I and my colleagues who are statisticians call multi-level data. And multi-level data are a fact of life. And I've got a very quick example here where I have site on the first table to the top left. Then I've got household information on the second table, and I have individual information within the household. So these are nested with each other. And in my first case, I've got Zambia as site number one, and I have 3 households that have information in Zambia, in Namibia, and so at site level, I've got a name, which is one of the characteristics of the higher level unit. Is Namibia, is of type pastoralist. At individual level, within that site, I have, at household level, I have the location of the household. Location is a characteristic a property of the household, and a household probably has a number of members, and a household might have the characteristic of farming being or not being important for their livelihood. Within the household, then we have individuals, and these individuals might have a characteristic which probably is gender. And you see in my data, I have coded gender as 0, 1, which is rather poor, because 0 doesn't necessarily mean male and 1 doesn't necessarily mean female. And that takes me to the need to define how I am coding my data. Coming back to the previous slide, without having proper identifiers that allow me to say which individual comes from which household and comes from which site, I will have serious difficulties in managing my data. In identifiers at each of the levels are really important and will be important when you need to manage the data across all these levels. A few reminders that I want to give you about working with data. The first one is that the key assumption when we start working with data is that we can rely on it. I would suggest we test it carefully. The fact is that once we start processing quantitative data using a calculator or a sophisticated calculator that lives in our computer, call it SPSS, call it R, call it whatever, we forget about the fact that that data has certain quality, and we should only do those processes of generating summaries and making inferences if we trust the data. So in statistics, the first assumption, and that one that is often implicit and we need to make explicit, is that the data can be relied on. And there are simple ways to keep this assumption at the top of our head. When you're working with the data set, always double check totals, number of rows, and number of columns. Desperate simple, but it allows you to make sure that you're working with complete data sets. So what you believe is a complete data set, what you have accepted is a complete data set, and that you are working with the data set that you should be working. Number of times that has not happened to professional statisticians is high. So please, this is basic, but it's essential. The next thing is do careful housekeeping of files. Files multiply and they become really difficult and messy. Good conventions on naming, good conventions on versions, good conventions, good variable labels, and keeping a good code book of your data are essential elements to ensure that you have good data available for your analysis. My preference for naming files is to give them a name that is descriptive and to append at the end of the name the date, starting with the year, following with the month, and then with the day of generation of the file. That allows me version control that is on a day-to-day basis, and often that is enough for data sets. Then when you're working with real data, you will realize that you have multiple files that are part of a single data set, and you need to merge, and that is putting them side by side, or you need to append data, and it is putting one up on top of the other. These processes are one of the weakest links in data management, and my recommendation is whenever you do that, always make sure that you know in advance how many rows and how many columns are to be expected, so that you can double check that your process of managing data by merging and appending is giving you the results that are correct. Run basic descriptive stats. Run descriptive frequency tables, produce a few box plots, produce some scatter plots to identify suspicious data. And please remember, suspicious data are not always wrong data. There will be a sensible decision to be made with respect to data that doesn't fit patterns that we expect, but identify them identifying them allow us to make the decision on what to do with them. The next recommendation that I would give you is keep a clean database that is fixed and that you don't modify much. Once you have got to the point of saying this data is data that I can rely on, it has been labeled, it is complete, so you keep a copy of that, make several copies of it if possible, and then derive data that come from it for all the work that you do. And because this is going to generate several data sets, whenever you work with one of them, make sure that you are working with the data set that you expect to be working with. Please keep backups. Data is the outcome of processes that are complex, that involve loads of contributions from loads of people, that are not repeatable, and is expensive. Good backups is important. Once you have done all of these, you will have a sense of how good your data sets are. And something that we know is that the quality of the data sets vary within the data set itself. So there is a section that is the section D in my questionnaire that we don't think work that well, and the quality and the potential of using it is not as good as others. So we make notes, we write reports first to ourselves to remind us of the quality of the data sets, and then probably, and I strongly recommend that we publish them with the data. And now that we can publish data, these quality diagnostic notes, that quality assessments become part of what is required to publish your data. Finally, we establish agreements about use and access to data with the respondents and with other stakeholders. These agreements need to be explicit, often are in the form of a consent with respect to respondents, but they can be in the form of contracts or exchange, formal or informal, with stakeholders that have a right and an interest in the data. We need to make sure that we use and we share the data according to the consent and agreements that we have with stakeholders. And so there are loads of practicalities about data management, and I am sure that with you, the PDFs, we are going to be discussing some of those as we support your process. But if I had to do in 20 minutes a description of what good data management implies, those would be the thoughts that come to mind. The next point that I want to discuss is digital data collection, but if there are any issues or any questions or any comments that you would like to make at this point, I am quite happy to stop for a moment and take some of your issues.
Okay, Juliet.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing some of those insights. I mean, I think what's really important is that it's very simple what you're saying, but often it's very difficult to actually put these into practical, into our practical efforts, because like you say, the field where we're collecting data is very complex. And so one of the things that came to me as important to follow up on is to do with the context within which we collect data. And your mention on, being sensitive to time, for example. But one of the other things that I've had to deal with, and I'm not sure about everybody else's experiences, which can undermine the data collection effort, is that sometimes time does mean money, and over-researched community members will actually ask you for money because previous NGOs or previous researchers have actually paid them. So what do you do in those contexts? If you are in a position where this particular respondent is necessary for your data collection, what are the ethical implications of actually collecting data? And what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Juliet. I've been there. I've seen that happening, and I think there are several parts to this, to my answer to it. The first one is, whenever we, as researchers, request someone to contribute to our research, we need to be very clear to them about what is in it for them. And we cannot assume that their time is valueless, and we cannot assume that their information comes at no cost either. The problem, I agree, is that some people and some organizations think that a good way, the easiest way to compensate is to provide payment. And it is a problem, not so much because often we don't have budget to make payment as well, but it is a problem because it establishes important sources of bias in the information that is provided, or it could introduce biases and biases that we are unable to understand. And from a research point of view, that is quite a serious issue. There are ethical elements to not having something to offer in exchange for the data. And very often what we have to offer in exchange for the individual data that they provide is information that comes as a result of the data that we collect. And that is easier done if we are working for a period of time with the same people, because they benefit from the research results themselves. And for me, that is the most satisfying compensation. And it is, I go into their lives with my agenda, my research agenda, and my interests, but I can come back into their lives with results that without me and without my research would not be possible, and that are of their interests. Working with farmers, one of the commodities that is highest in the value scales is information, useful and practical information. So it might be that it's not going to be immediately after I have done the interviews or collected the data through living with them for a while that I can give them results from my research, but it is very likely that I have information that is of value to them immediately. So a transaction that I feel more comfortable with is a transaction of information. Sometimes it is not possible to get their participation without payment. And I think if the budget allows it, and that is only because somebody else has made it impossible for us to collect information without payment, I think the rates of payment need to be considered carefully. And the next stages, we need to consider carefully how we avoid that, or try to identify the bias that will be introduced. I would ask people and organizations to think as of the money compensation as one of the last possible options. Is certainly not a good one for research.
Okay, Seamus?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thanks everybody. Great seminar again. I just have a quick question about your units of analysis. You had a nice slide there where you were nesting your sample from site location to household composition and then specific households. And then you talked about the segregated data collection standards published by CGIAR DOS. So it's going to be really interesting when we get into the quantitative rankings of people's preferred traits of tilapia. And I think this kind of nesting is important in Egypt for many geographical reasons and market context reasons. Do you have much experience jumping here to another kind of data set, much experience looking at attitudes, gender norms, comparing between households and your unit of analysis to look at that, and then making connections with that kind of data set to what I was just talking about there, quantitative findings of market preferences?
I suppose the answer is yes. We have had to deal with I personally have had to deal with multi-level data for a long time, and so has Alex and Sam, who then the three of us are going to be working with you. And what is important in this is that there are two aspects. One is a purely conceptual, and that purely conceptual aspect is going to be the result of a good discussion with you on what is useful, because all of these are constructs that we build with the data. So are the constructs and the conceptual side of them sensible? Are they tenable? Are they defendable? And that is an interesting discussion between the scientists and the analyst, the data analyst. I distinguish the two functions. And there is another side to it, and it's a purely practical side, and it's how do you actually do the management of the data? How do you bring them together? How do you, for example, go from my table where I have the individual level information? How do you produce aggregated information from individuals that can be put together with the household level data? Or how you go from the household characteristics into the individuals to try to establish relationships of association or causality. And so those practical aspects require a little bit of experience on purely mechanical data management, and that's something that we hope we're going to be able to share with you, but it's something that at the moment doesn't concern us much.
It's great, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Nabil?
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very great. It actually is not a question as it is a comment. When I was dealing many with data, and one of the most useful things that I faced is when I have this data, because it's very great data, since it consists of many records, maybe thousands of records. So it's impossible to be observed by your eyes, naked eyes. So the most effective thing that I faced is making the maximum and minimum values in order to share, in order to test the validity of this data, test the, because if you just depend on the means, this means that in some cases, this means fake means, depends on some zero values, some negative values, which is not true, which it comes from wrong calculations or something like this. So when I face this, it's very good to put in your consideration that first of all, before of dealing with any data, you can make these maximum and minimum values to show this, to see everything obviously. I won't share this with you all. Thank you.
Nabil, absolutely. We come out of formal processes of education obsessed with averages, and society is obsessed with averages. And I think averages have a place in life, but they are overrated. Mainly when dealing with quantitative data, we're interested in the spread of the data and the variability of the data, and being able to explain variability or the joint variability of more than one variable. And you are absolutely right. Looking at maximums and minimums or data quality control is an essential element of the task. I in my presentation on this slide, I talked about frequency tables, because that allows you to see every single value and how often they occur. Box plots, which I am not sure whether you've seen or not. They are basically representations of a full data set, including some idea of what is the shape of the distribution that they have, and the maximum and minimum are really important elements on that. And it is through those techniques and through scatter plots, so to access and see how the cloud of dots appear, Those are really important elements, very basic tools, but extremely powerful to try to see whether there is consistency or not in our data set. Thank you for your contribution.
So the last hand raised is Lem. If anybody else wants to make any contribution or any question, please raise it now. Thank you. Lem.
Okay, thank you so much for the nice presentation. My question is related to this ethical issue to share the data. So are we going to, expected to have individual agreement from each and every respondent, or is there any other mechanism? So if so, how we are going to present also this kind of agreement to the publisher while we are requested?
Lem, thank you. Normally, what we do at the beginning of an interview with anybody is we tell them why we're collecting the data, how the data is to be used, and the extent to which we are offering two important levels of access to their information. One is anonymity, and it is, some people might look at your information, but they will not know who you are. And the second is confidentiality, and it is assuring the provider of the information about whether who is going to have access to the personal information. So anonymity and confidentiality are key elements of this individual agreement that we establish with whoever responds to the questions or participates in this exchange of information. So normally in surveys, that's a paragraph that is read right at the beginning of the survey, so that people have the opportunity to give you explicit and, to the best of our ability, informed consent to collect and use the information. So yes, it is an individual level, and often normally is done right at the beginning of the interview process. Now, we have a new challenge these days. As you know, the CG has adopted an open data policy, and quite a number of the funding agencies, governmental or intergovernmental, are asking for data to be made a public good and to be open for public use. That has imposed a new requirement on that agreement that we established with the individuals who provide the information, and how we manipulate the data in such a way that that consent can be retained even when the data is published. And there are processes of anonymization and processes that ensure that that we minimize the risk that someone is identified within a data set. Some issues often happen because we take GPS locations and names, characteristics of individuals that are unique in their communities. And so we need to bear that in mind quite carefully, and is something that has always been important, but the arrival of the open data policies have made even more relevant. We could share with you some shapes of some examples of consent agreements, Alex is suggesting, Alex sitting next to me is suggesting that I stop sharing my screen so that he can show you an example of one. Actually, he is showing it, but he's showing it to me. I think you can see it now. Here is an example for a health survey where the introduction and consent says something along the lines of, hello, my name is, and this is my name, and I am working with Project XXX, who have partnered with the Minister of Health of the government of this country to conduct a study. The purpose of this study is the participant selection is established the procedures on how the interview is going to happen are established to the risks and discomforts, the benefits that they have, confidentiality, and the fact that it is voluntary participation and explained in detail. And then contact information for the research about the researcher and the project is given to the people who are responding. And this sets the framework for the conversation to take place.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the first thing we do when we start analyzing the data is usually anonymize the data set. So removing anything that may help find the respondent. So names, name of the respondent, addresses, name of the head of the household, and all these kind of things are removed before the data analysis is started.
So there are aspects of sharing data, and you might have found them or might find them in the future. For example, an organization that's international is required to make data open access, whereas the national organization that is working is legally bound not to share data. So it often happens with government departments who are legally bound by confidentiality and anonymity. Research institutes sometimes have internal policies, and that we are beginning to face this new reality in the change that occurs because organizations that we work for or who fund our research are requiring open data. Open data is a good thing in general, is my view, but it imposes a number of additional challenges. Okay, so I do have a second part to this presentation. Last time we took a lot longer than required, and this time around we expect not to go beyond the 1 hour and 30 minutes in these discussions. We have now used 50 minutes of our time, but if it is okay with you, I would like to discuss a little bit about digital data collection and what it offers and what are some of the consequences of bringing this technology into our processes of collecting data. And I would like to say that to highlight some potentially useful points that we have learned from using and supporting the use of mobile devices for data collection. And I am just curious about whether this is something that you have done in the past. And so if you could just raise your hand to see who is familiar with the technology and who is not, then I can adjust my comments to the level of familiarity of the group. So, okay, thank you. So I will assume curiosity, but not much experience on the issues. The first thing that I want to do is to kind of talk about how does mobile data collection work and what are the key components of this process. And it's a little bit more complex than taking your field notebook into the field with you and a good pair of pencils and a sharpener. And it is because we start using components of technology. By definition, we need a mobile device of some type or another. We would need a form that works on the mobile device. The information is collected there, and often more and more these days is collected and transmitted directly to a server that is based on a cloud. The transmission is done either through mobile cell phone networks or is done through Wi-Fi. Eventually, the data is aggregated on the server and the data lives in the cloud, but we need to bring it down to a computer where we normally would be working with it. And in this whole process of mixing technology with humans, we have different functions for the people that work with us. We have form designers, we have form programmers, we have testers, we have data collectors, and we have data providers. And interestingly, this whole thing could be managed and done by one person. If it is my PhD and I have no support from anybody else, then I have to cope with the whole complexity of the process, and I fulfill all the functions except the function of data provider. And when the operations are large and complex, then it involves small armies of people, experts working on different bits of it. So rather than trying to describe the process as a one-fits-all needs, I want to start looking at the different components so that probably it helps you forming an idea of how this can be done. It has become very, very simple. You don't know me and you haven't seen me, but I've been working on this kind of things for about 30 years. So a lot. I am a lot older than most of you. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, I was not at all interested in using this type of technology. And my main concern was that the moment that we hand over the decisions on what is collected and how it's collected to people who are not directly involved in the research but are involved in the technology, we lose control of what is collected and how it's collected, and very often that doesn't give good results. So it is really important that the person or the people who are at the center of the research definition of the research are also in control of the process of data collection. That has happened over the last 5 years, and now I have had to learn. I have fully embraced data collection using mobile devices. So let me tell you the experience of someone who was very skeptical about this whole thing and how the different components come together. So you've got a cloud server, and basically what it is used for is to aggregate data that is collected. Aggregation is what we call the fact that I collect an instance of data, an interview with Cynthia, and I have it I have done it in the field on my cell phone, and I send it to the server. And the next time that I interview someone, Seamus, then it goes and joins the chain of data. So it gets aggregated. That's what these servers do very well. More and more, these servers are providing help for designing forms. So they have facilities that allow me to design forms very, very easily. They work really well, those form design tools, they work really well for very simple, relatively simple forms. If the forms become complex, they are not particularly good. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And the other thing that they do wonderfully is to support monitoring of how the data is being entered. At the end of this presentation, there is a reference to a blog that Alex wrote after he had been monitoring data collection in 5 countries in Central Asia. And as the data was being collected in 5 of those countries, Alex was on a daily basis monitoring how data collection was happening. And that is because the collection was being done, the data was being aggregated in the server. And the servers have that amazing ability to allow us to understand how data is being collected. Something they do not do well is to store data for the long term. So I've come across many researchers who say, so I've collected my data, it is in the server, can I keep it there forever? You probably can keep it forever, but those are not good places to keep them. They are very cumbersome for data management, very cumbersome for sharing data, so not good places that they could do, but I would suggest you don't use them for that purpose. The other thing they are not good at are analyzing, that is processing data. And there are loads of those servers and they change all the time. At today is the 10th of May 2018, one of the best servers that exist for this purpose is cobotoolbox.org. And it's very good because it has a very robust software working there, but also because it's got funding from important large organizations that will guarantee that it remains working for the foreseeable future. But something we know is that it is going to have a normal process like any living organism. It has flourished. It is being very productive, and at some point it's going to disappear. It's not disappearing in the foreseeable future. So you've got the idea that a big computer, a server that is maintained by someone else, probably not by you, although it could be maintained by you if you have a large project, exists, and I call that the aggregator or the server. The other thing that you will need is a form, is the definition of a form that will allow you to use your mobile device to do the data collection. And something important about forms in mobile devices is that more work is needed for mobile versions than for paper versions of questionnaires. In fact, you would have to design your questionnaire or your series of questions on paper before you are able to do that for a mobile device, which means that the workflow is front-loaded. There is a lot more work that needs to be done in advance than when we were working with paper, and that has serious implications in how you allocate resources, time, money, and skills. So in the past, it was possible to go to the field with a paper questionnaire and make adjustments kind of by writing on the margins of the questionnaire. With the forms, that's not possible. In the past, the flow of the questionnaire was something that was given by training interviewers. In this case, it needs to be programmed into the form. So be aware of that and allow enough time to be able to do that. Often I have said that using a badly designed form is a little bit like getting on a motorbike without brakes. And I compare the paper form like going all the way on foot. So my choice between a motorbike without brakes and walking is clear. I will walk. My choice between a badly designed form and a paper form is easy. I'll use paper. So when I talk about designing forms, there are 3 stages in this process of development. The first stage is the content design. Content design is what questions, what data is to be collected, and that is the responsibility of the researcher, of the person or group that are interested in specific information. And that often is done in paper. The next stage is to take that definition of data needs and program it, and I call that form scripting. That is often the responsibility of someone who is good at programming. But now it is quite easy to do, and I am seeing much more a combination of the person who designs the form and the person who scripts the form being the same person. The next stage is form testing, and this cannot be overstressed. Form testing is crucial because the form guides you through the flow of the data collection. It involves validation tests. It could include support, and it's highly recommended that it includes support in terms of definitions, instruction codes, and images. And it's necessary also to make sure that the form, the questioning, the instructions are understandable by the data collector, by the data provider. So testing is much more than what we used to do with paper questionnaires. And I see that as a big advantage, because we often were not careful enough with testing questionnaires. With forms, we don't have an option if we want to be successful in our data collection process. And so that's really extra work, but there are some real benefits that come from it. And so, for example, when we have forms on mobile devices, rosters, household rosters, for example, and supporting information come naturally and very easily into the whole questionnaire. The other thing that works absolutely beautifully is the issue of translations. Translations are very easy to do and to integrate, and we have had 3 or 4 languages on the same form for the price and effort of one. And the next thing that often happens is that we are able to integrate into the form very detailed help with sampling processes and replacements. So there are real advantages of doing all this work in advance. How do you script these forms? Look, there are multiple options. One of the most powerful tools that we have at the moment is called ODK, Open Data Kit. It's a project that was started some 10 years ago by a PhD student from Nigeria who was funded by Google, and it became what is actually an extremely powerful ecosystem for data collection. It's Google, so you can imagine when it went for Android. There are proprietary software that has been developed by private firms, and most of the software that works on iPhones belongs to that category. There is a very robust environment that is called CS Pro and is specialized for survey data collection, and it was developed by the US Bureau of Census. Or you could choose to write your own program using C++. I would suggest you don't do that. That work has already been done by someone else. So there is a wide variety of choices. In my team, we have adopted Open Data Kit because it's free, because it's easy, because it has become a standard in a large number of operations. In practice, if you are going to use ODK, there are 2 options today. One is to use the form builders in the ODK servers, like the Kobo toolbox, and the other is to do your definition of the form using Excel to prepare your form. And there is a really good website called xlsform.org, where you could, in a couple of hours, become pretty good at writing your own forms. I don't know if any of you completed the form that I sent. For those of you who completed it, it took me 5 minutes, probably less, to prepare it. And I used it using Kobo Toolbox. I'm moving now, and I'm in the website for Kobo Toolbox, and I have created an account. It's for researchers, aid workers, and everyone else. I think I am an everyone else. I log in. I've got several forms here, but the one I want to show you is the one that says webinar to WorldFish. And my form is here, and the Kobo Toolbox allows me to fill it in using a website or a cell phone, and the different ways of doing that. My form is here. I can preview the form, and it's coming up. And I was asking in your name, where you are today, what is 2 plus 2, take a picture with your cell phone, tell me using your mobile device where you are. And it records your GPS coordinates. I am going to go and look at the data that is stored just to see if 2 of my colleagues had completed it. Juliet. Well, that's Stephanie as well. Thank you. So I can see who has completed it. I can see the data that has been put in, and I've got a table here. I've got the data from Juliet, who is in Germany. I have one empty one here, one from Stephanie, who is in Malaysia, one from David Kingdom, United Kingdom, and one from Sam in the UK as well. Nice, I can see the whole data set. And guess what? You all got that 2 plus 2 is 4, except that some of my colleagues started trying to get it, to put the wrong answer. I'll tell you what happens when you try to put the wrong answer there. I will put, if I say that 2 plus 2 is 20, I have created a validation rule that tells me that, sorry, your answer is incorrect, please check again. And so they were having loads of fun doing that. But I can look at my data, and something that I think is really, really useful is to look at the map of where these answers come from. And I have one answer that was recorded as coming from Greenland, one as recorded from the UK, and guess what? I have one here on the on Malaysia. So as data is collected, you can actually go and see in more detail, and I'm going to take you to see where this data was collected in the UK. And guess where it was recorded? It was recorded in Reading, and it was recorded in our offices. So very, very powerful ways of looking at the data. If I look at the form, I said you can script the form using this server. I click on this little pen here, and these are my questions. I could add an extra question here and say, how are you today? And this is a question that is of different types, and I'm going to select one, and the possible answers are very well, okay, or not too well. Okay. And I'm going to save that, and it has been successfully updated. I'm going to close that, and I'm going to preview it, and you will see that now my form has a new question. So really easy to edit if my form is relatively easy. If the form is not so easy, so if I have complex jumps and I have choices and I have all sorts of extra information, these forms can be developed using an Excel format where you have the type of question, you have the name of the variable, you have the label that is exactly what you're going to be seeing on your mobile, and you have a number of characteristics of the questions, including constraints where I say that the answer should be equal to 4 when you say 2 plus 2. So very accessible for us who are interested in the research more than the IT. I said that, but when it becomes difficult to program any of these forms, I have to go to my colleagues here who are much better at doing that sort of thing than I am. And let me just go back to the presentation. So 2 ways that are very easy to define forms. The next element, so we started with the server, Then we went to the form. I want to go to the mobile devices, and common questions on this area is, which type of mobile device do I need? Can I use Android or iPhone? Look, depending on what server and what software you use, you will probably go for Android or iPhone. My recommendation at the moment, and this is biased, is that Android is providing the best facilities for researchers who are working in the type of conditions that you are working, particularly because Android devices are more common in the places where we work. Do we need to use mobile phones, or should we be using tablets? The experience tells us that mobile phones are giving better results, in particular because loads of people know them and they don't become something that interrupts the flow of the conversation and data collection. And do I need to put an app? Okay, so this system, this environment, ODK, includes an app that can be installed on your cell phone, and that makes the interview process a lot easier. And there are several of them. The one that we're using at the moment is called Kobo Collect. How modern has to be my cell phone? All of this works with very basic mobile devices. How much memory and storage capacity? Very little. So basic cell phones are good enough. Just remember that battery life is important, and you don't want to run out of battery during your data collection process, and that having extra energy sources is important. Something that we have been taking into account is the fact that more modern cell phones have camera resolutions that are much bigger, and therefore the pictures that they take are much larger, and transmitting those photographs over bad cell phone networks or with not broadband can take a lot of time. So be careful with the camera resolution. I was talking to one of my IT colleagues yesterday, and he said the latest version of Kobo Collect allows, if you go into the admin setup, to limit the size of the photos. And so we are struggling with hardware going far too fast in relation to the conditions that we work. GPS chips, are they different in different phones? They seem to be different, but they don't make a huge difference. One of the important things with GPS coordinates is that sometimes, depending on availability of satellites, it takes a long time for them to get with precision. So if you're going to take GPS coordinates anywhere, do it at the end of the interview and not during the interview or at the beginning of the interview, because it can be really annoying. And then, yes, but I have a table on my paper questionnaire that has got 20 rows by 7 columns. How do I do that on my cell phone? My suggestion is one question at a time and use good flow rather than trying to pack a big table into a little screen. It's more user-friendly. And the other thing that with mobile devices is the issue of security of people in the field. And depending where we are, that can or cannot be an issue. And there are some places where I would not send myself or any of my colleagues or a local team to collect data using a mobile phone, basically because they will put them at risk. Communication networks, gosh, yes, I've collected my data. Now I need to transmit it. Do I do it using, do I collect and transmit immediately? If you can, yes, that makes a lot of sense. That makes it safe. Should I use the network, cell phone network or Wi-Fi? It doesn't make a difference if your cell phone network is good enough. What happens if the communication fails? This is well tested, and what happens is that next time you are within range, it can be transmitted. Do I need to be online to collect information? No, you don't if you use the app. The whole thing can be done offline. Can I use GPS when I am offline? Yes, you can. So loads of these questions have been tested and are safe and easy to solve. People side of things, and this is really, really important. People side of things is you must be involved in the design. Programmers, don't leave a programmer to make the big decisions, be part of the decision making. I was involved in a relatively large data collection in Kenya a few years ago, and the main partner selected a local programmer to develop a data entry form. And the data entry worked well on the screen of the phone. It was a real problem in terms of the data structures that the programmer developed, and we spent more time and resources repairing the data than collecting the data. Be very careful and test carefully. And one of the key tests that you must remember is test that the data is properly uploaded, and once it is uploaded, it can be downloaded and you can read it and use it. That's what failed with this group of people that I was supporting in repairing the data set. Data collectors will need to have different skills from people who do it on paper. People who do it on paper can have very large hands and not skillful thumbs to work with a cell phone. That's changed if we are going to use mobile devices. They need to be capable enough to deal with the technology. And data providers, those who answer the questions. Look, it's really interesting. They are not face-to-face interviews. They have become side-by-side interviews. People sit side by side, look at the cell phone, and enter the information together. It actually can engage people much better. And the other thing is that as a person, you can as a person involved in monitoring all of this, you have a much better ability to see how the process is going. But please, please, please allow enough time and budget if you are going to use mobile devices. It's not much more expensive, but it's much more time and skill demanding. Changing from paper to digital collection implies an important change in the process because a lot of the work needs to be done before you collect the data. So make sure that you allocate enough resources and enough time. And particularly you are just beginning to try out these approaches. Here are a number of probably useful links. Digital data collection, a series of interviews about opportunities and challenges. These are on YouTube and were produced actually for one of the projects of the CGIAR, the drylands, how do you call them? CRP. And there are 4 interviews where some of my colleagues and I share of this some of these experiences. The next one is Alex's blog. It's Lessons Learned from a Multi-Country Survey. There's a link to the xlsform.org where loads of people have learned to develop forms. I'm sure you have read the standards for collecting sex disaggregated data. Rereading it is very useful. And I have included it here too. And I have also included a link to CS Pro that is been designed for surveys. I finish here and I believe we've got around 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, any hands raised? Okay, we have Shemos to start with.
Hi, thank you, Carlos. It was really comprehensive. So for ethical reasons, I've written into the survey design about scrambling geolocation data to a certain distance. So I haven't got around to that yet, and I wonder, do you have advice? And maybe we can talk about that another time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah?
We have advice and we have experience on doing that. There are a couple. options of doing it using R automatically, and there are a few suggestions in the literature about how to do that. It's really important, but it's also important to have the ability to keep a private data set that maintains the geolocations. In particular, if you're going to do things like trying to follow up with the same farmer. So here then we face the need to anonymize or scramble the geolocations, while at the same time keeping them for the purposes of the research. And here we start with the processes of generating public and private versions of data sets.
Two other points that I would just say to the group is I worked and learned a lot from Seren with ODK and the Excel and developing the survey software. But I think it's important for us to remember to be very explicit in how we write our contracts for our survey partners, especially in countries where we can't go into the field and be the enumerator or manage the enumerators, is that they use the software that we specifically require them to use. So a lot of survey firms here will use Serverletics copy, and that means that it's done mostly offline. And really the ODK push, I think, in the WorldFish research network is so that we can see it live. We can manage and validate the data live as it's coming in, and that we can check that everything we've written in the TOR of the survey is being conducted correctly, like sampling and et cetera, et cetera. So for example, because the copy users here did it their own way, there's sections of my survey that's missing. So yeah, I think it's really important that we're very careful about how we write these details into the contract with our survey partners.
Thank you, Seamus. Absolutely, couldn't agree more with you. I've paid the price of not doing that, and you please take that very seriously.
Okay, nobody else.
The other thing is that this PowerPoint presentation is shared in the Dropbox, and is the form in XLS, and we can continue our discussions a little later.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Alex, for this nice presentation again. And yes, we look forward for the next meeting next Thursday. And I hope you will all be around, even more people. And yeah, good week.
Nice talking to you all. Again, I join Stephanie to say have a successful week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.